The fiddle music died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence that swept across the crowded Silver Springs saloon. All eyes fixed on the center of the room, where a young woman stood frozen, her face burning with shame as wine dripped from the hem of her faded, mended gown. The mayor's daughter laughed, a cruel, ringing sound that invited the rest of the town to join in the humiliation. "Did you sew that from a potato sack, darling?" she sneered. Tears welled in the girl's eyes, and she turned to run, but a heavy boot stomped on the floorboards, shaking the room. A rugged stranger, shadowed by his hat, stepped out from the dark corner. His voice was low like thunder, stopping every heart in the room. "Pick up your head, ma'am," he growled, hand hovering near his holster. "You're the only royalty in this room of beggars." The wind howling through the cracks of the Vance cabin always sounded like a mourning song, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Elara Vance sat by the dying embers of the hearth, her fingers trembling as she threaded the needle for the 100th time that night. Outside, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming Territory lay bathed in moonlight. But inside, Elara's world was small, confined to the flickering light of a single tallow candle and the pile of fabric in her lap. It was her mother's dress. Once, it had been a vibrant cornflower blue, the kind of silk that whispered of better days in St. Louis before the westward trek had stolen the bloom from her mother's cheeks. Now, after 20 years in the dust of Copper Creek, the blue had faded to a ghostly grey slate, and the silk was worn thin at the elbows and waist. Elara had spent the last 3 nights turning the collar, patching the tears with scraps from an old sash, and sewing on tiny glass beads she had found in a tin box under the floorboards. "It's foolish, Elara," she whispered to herself, the needle pricking her thumb. A drop of blood beaded on her skin, stark red against the pale fabric. Going to the mayor's jubilee in a dead woman's rags. But she had no choice. The letter from the bank sat on the rough-hewn table, its edges crisp and threatening. Final notice of foreclosure. Banker Julian Blackwood had made it clear: pay the outstanding debt on her father's cattle loan by the end of the month, or the Vance Ranch, every acre of scrub brush and the winding creek that cut through it would be auctioned off. The Jubilee wasn't just a dance. It was the only time all the town's heavy hitters would be in one room, lubricated by whiskey and joviality. It was her only chance to corner Blackwood publicly, to plead for an extension, or perhaps to find a buyer for the few head of cattle she had left before the bank seized them. She stood up, shaking out the dress. It hung loosely on her frame. Since her father, Thomas Vance, had passed during the blizzard last winter, food had been scarce. She was thin, her collarbones sharp, her hands roughened by chopping wood and hauling water. She didn't look like a lady. She looked like a survivor. A knock at the heavy oak door made her jump. It was late, past the hour for decent folk to be calling. Elara reached for the shotgun, leaning against the mantel, her movements practiced and fluid. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Just a traveler, ma'am," a deep, gravelly voice replied. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It carried the slow drawl of the deep south, mixed with the grit of the trail. "Horse threw a shoe a mile back, saw the light, just looking for water." Elara hesitated. The law of the West dictated hospitality, but a woman alone had to be cautious. She cracked the door, keeping the chain fastened and the barrel of the shotgun visible in the gap. Standing on her porch was a man who looked as if he had been carved out of the mountain itself. He was tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the moon. A battered Stetson was pulled low over his eyes, obscuring his face in shadow, but she could see the stubble on his jaw and the dust coating his duster coat. He didn't look like a bandit, but he certainly didn't look like a gentleman. He looked dangerous in a quiet way, like a dormant volcano. "Buckets by the well," Ilara said, nodding toward the yard. "Help yourself, then keep moving. I have nothing worth stealing." The stranger chuckled, a low rumble. He tipped his hat, revealing a pair of piercing eyes, colorless in the dark, but sharp. "Wasn't planning on stealing, ma'am. Just thirsty." He paused, his gaze dropping to the dress she was still clutching in her left hand. "Fancy night?" Ilara flushed, pulling the dress behind the door. "None of your business." "Fair enough," he said. He walked to the well, drank deeply from the ladle, and then turned back. "Name's Silas. Silas Thorne. If anyone asks—" "Nobody will ask, Mr. Thorne," Ilara said coldly. "Because nobody comes out this far. Maybe that's for the best," Silas murmured, more to himself than to her. He mounted his horse, a massive black stallion that favored its left hoof, and tipped his hat again. "Obliged for the water." Ilara watched him ride off into the darkness, a strange shiver running down her spine. She locked the door, leaning her forehead against the wood. She couldn't afford distractions. Tomorrow was the Jubilee. Tomorrow, she would walk into the lion's den wearing a ghost's dress, and pray she didn't get eaten alive. The town of Silver Springs was booming. The discovery of copper in the nearby hills had turned a dusty stopover into a hive of activity. Gas lamps lined the main street, casting a golden glow over the wooden boardwalks where miners, ranchers, and opportunists mingled. The town hall, a newly constructed two-story building with white pillars that looked out of place against the rugged landscape, was ablaze with light. Fiddles and a piano spilled music out onto the street, a lively reel that clashed with the knot of dread in Ilara's stomach. She had hitched her old mare, Bess, around the back, away from the shiny carriages and thoroughbreds of the town's elite. Ilara smoothed the front of her dress. In the harsh light of the lanterns, the fading dye looked even more uneven, the mending more obvious. She had tried to curl her hair, pinning it up with the tortoise-shell comb her father had given her, but wisps were already escaping, framing a face that was too pale, too serious for a party. She took a deep breath and walked up the steps. The interior of the hall was stiflingly hot and smelled of cigars, lavender water, and roasting beef. Tables were laden with food, roasted pheasants, hams glazed with honey, towers of cakes that made Ilara's mouth water painfully. She hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. She stayed near the wall, scanning the crowd. She saw Mayor Sterling, a portly man with a red face, laughing loudly near the punch bowl, and there, standing by the fireplace, was Julian Blackwood. The banker was a sharp-featured man with slicked-back oil-black hair and a suit that cost more than Ilara's farm. He was holding court, surrounded by men who nodded eagerly at whatever he said. Hanging on his arm was Lydia Sterling, the mayor's daughter. Lydia was the undisputed queen of Silver Springs. She wore a gown of emerald green satin, imported from Paris, with a bustle so large it demanded its own space. Her neck dripped with gold. She was beautiful, in a predatory way, her eyes scanning the room for flaws she could pick apart. Ilara steeled herself. She had to do this. She began to push through the crowd, murmuring apologies as she navigated the sea of bodies. "Mr. Blackwood," Ilara said, her voice sounding small in the din. Julian Blackwood turned, his smile vanishing the moment he saw her. He looked her up and down, his lip curling slightly. "Miss Vance, I didn't expect to see you here. The entry fee was substantial." "I need a moment of your time, sir," Ilara said, ignoring the jab. "About the extension. I have a buyer coming from Cheyenne next week for the herd. If you could just give me until— This is a party, Ilara, Lydia interrupted, her voice shrill and sweet like poisoned syrup. She stepped forward, placing a possessive hand on Julian's chest. Not a charity ward. Besides, Julian doesn't discuss business with people of your standing. Lydia's eyes raked over Ilara's dress. She leaned in, whispering loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear. Is that your mother's wedding dress? Good heavens, Ilara. It smells like mothballs and desperation. A titter of laughter rippled through the group. Ilara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. It's a fine dress, she said, her chin lifting. And I am here to discuss business that concerns the future of my land. Your land? Julian laughed, a harsh, barking sound. That patch of dirt is barely worth the paper the deed is written on. The only reason the bank hasn't taken it yet is because the paperwork is a bore. But don't worry. Monday morning the sheriff will be out to clear you off. You can't, Ilara said, her voice trembling. My father paid interest on that loan for 10 years. Interest isn't principal, my dear, Julian sneered. He turned back to the crowd, dismissing her. Run along now. Go find the buffet. I'm sure you're hungry. Lara stood there, frozen. The dismissal was absolute. The humiliation was burning her skin. She turned to leave, her eyes blurry with unshed tears. But Lydia wasn't done. The mayor's daughter didn't just want to win, she wanted to destroy. As Ilara turned, Lydia accidentally jutted out her silk-slippered foot. Ilara stumbled. She tried to catch herself, but her worn boot heel caught on the uneven floorboards. She pitched forward, crashing into a waiter carrying a tray of red wine. The crash was deafening. Glass shattered. The tray upended. Ilara landed hard on her knees, gasping as the dark red liquid splashed over her arms, her chest, and the skirt of the faded blue dress. She looked like she had been shot. The music screeched to a halt. The room went silent. Ilara knelt amidst the broken glass, the wine soaking into the old silk, ruining the only thing of value she had left. She looked up and saw Lydia covering her mouth in mock horror, her eyes dancing with malicious glee. "Oh my," Lydia exclaimed, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "Look at the mess. Though honestly, that wine is an improvement on the color. It covers the stains, at least." The crowd erupted in laughter. It wasn't just the elite. Even the shopkeepers and the hands laughed, swept up in the cruelty of the moment. Ilara felt small, insignificant, a piece of trash to be swept away. She tried to stand, but her legs felt like lead. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. "Well?" Julian shouted, stepping forward. "Don't just sit there, girl. You've ruined the floor. Get out before I have the marshal drag you out." Ilara sobbed, a single, broken sound. She scrambled to get her footing, slipping on the wine. Thud. The heavy doors of the hall swung open with violent force, slamming against the interior walls. The laughter died in throats. The wind from outside swirled in, extinguishing the candles nearest the door. In the entryway stood a man. He was dressed in black denim and a charcoal shirt, a gun belt slung low on his hips. A long duster coat billowed around him. It was the stranger from the cabin, Silas Thorne. But in the light of the hall, he looked even more imposing. He wasn't dusty anymore. He was groomed, sharp, yet still carrying an air of wild, untamed danger. He walked into the room, his spurs chiming with a deadly rhythm. Clink, step, clink. The crowd parted for him instinctively, like the Red Sea. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at Lydia. His eyes were locked on Ilara, who was still on her knees in the wine and glass. Silas stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at the surrounding crowd, his gaze cold enough to freeze whiskey. "I've seen packs of wolves with better manners," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the room. It was a voice of command. "Who the hell are you?" Julian demanded, stepping forward, his face reddening. "This is a private event." Silas ignored him. He took off his hat, holding it in one hand, and extended the other toward Elara. His hand was large, scarred, and steady as a rock. "Take my hand, Miss Vance," Silas said softly, the harshness leaving his tone entirely. Elara looked up at him, bewildered. "I'm a mess. The dress doesn't make the woman," Silas said, loud enough for Lydia to hear. "And right now, looking at this room full of silk and cowards," he swept his gaze over the stunned onlookers, "you're still the finest woman here." A gasp went through the room. Elara reached out. Her trembling, wine-stained fingers grasped his rough hand. Silas pulled her up effortlessly, steadying her when she wobbled. He didn't let go of her hand. He unclasped his heavy duster coat and draped it over her shoulders, covering the wine stains. The coat was warm and smelled of leather and tobacco. It felt like armor. "Now," Silas turned to Julian Blackwood, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You mentioned something about a debt?" Julian blinked, thrown off balance by the stranger's sheer presence. "Who are you?" "I'm Julian Blackwood. I own the bank in this town." "I know who you are," Silas said, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a folded document and tossed it onto a nearby table. "And I'm Silas Thorne. I just bought the territorial charter for the railroad that's coming through here next spring." The room went dead silent. The railroad was a myth, a rumor that promised untold riches. "And," Silas continued, taking a step toward Julian, looming over the banker, "I also just bought the debt for the Vance Ranch from your regional office in Cheyenne this morning. Miss Vance doesn't owe you a dime. She owes me." He turned back to Elara, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "And I'm a very patient creditor. Shall we dance, Miss Vance?" The silence in the hall stretched so thin it felt as though it might snap. The revelation that the railroad was indeed coming, and that this stranger held the keys to the kingdom, left the town's elite paralyzed. Julian Blackwood's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of paste. He looked from the document on the table to Silas, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a riverbank. "You can't just buy a debt like that without my signature," Julian sputtered, his voice cracking. "Check the telegraph office," Silas replied coolly, not bothering to look at the banker. "The wire came through an hour ago. Your superiors in Chicago prefer gold to your slow-moving foreclosure paperwork." Lydia Sterling, sensing the shift in power, dropped Julian's arm as if it were burning hot. She smoothed her emerald dress and took a tentative step toward Silas, her eyelashes fluttering. "Mr. Thorne, was it? My father, the mayor, would be delighted to—" "I didn't ask for the mayor," Silas cut her off, his voice flat. He turned his back on her, a deliberate slight that caused a ripple of shocked whispers. His attention was solely on Elara. Elara felt lightheaded. The coat around her shoulders was heavy, grounding her, but the world was spinning. "I don't know how to dance," she whispered frantically to Silas. "Not the way they do." "Just follow me," Silas murmured. "Don't look at them. Look at me." He signaled the band leader with a sharp nod. The pianist, terrified to disobey, fumbled into a slow waltz. Silas placed one hand on Elara's waist, over the coat, and held her hand with the other. He moved with surprising grace for a man of his size. He guided her away from the puddle of wine, sweeping her into the center of the floor. For the first few moments, Elara was stiff, her boots feeling clumsy on the polished wood. She could feel the eyes of the town boring into her back, judging, hating, calculating. But Silas held her firm. His gaze was an anchor. His eyes were a startling shade of hazel, flecked with gold, and they held no pity, only a quiet, fierce respect. "Why?" Elara asked softly as they turned. "Why did you do this? I can't pay you back. If you bought the debt, I have no money." "I told you," Silas said, spinning her so that her back was to Lydia and Julian. "I was thirsty. You gave me water. In my book, that's a debt worth repaying." "That's not enough of a reason to buy a mortgage," Elara insisted, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Men like you don't do favors for nothing." Silas's expression tightened slightly. "Men like me. Rich men. Powerful men." Silas chuckled darkly. "I haven't always been rich, Elara, and power is just a tool. Sometimes you use it to build, sometimes you use it to break." He glanced over her shoulder at Julian Blackwood, who was now whispering furiously with the mayor. "And there's plenty in this town that needs breaking." As they danced, the initial shock of the crowd wore off, replaced by a buzzing curiosity. The dynamic of the room had shifted. Elara Vance, the pariah, was now in the arms of the most powerful man in the territory. Lydia watched them with eyes that burned with hatred. She grabbed Julian's arm, digging her nails into his suit jacket. "Do something!" she hissed. "He's humiliating us. He's dancing with that beggar in a horse blanket." "He owns the railroad charter, Lydia," Julian hissed back, sweating. "If he routes the tracks south of the creek, the land we've been buying up is worthless. We need him on our side." "He's clearly chosen a side," Lydia spat. "He chose the girl, so we need to get rid of the girl." On the dance floor, Silas leaned in closer to Elara. "Listen to me carefully, Elara. When this song ends, I'm going to walk you out. I'll take you home." "I can ride, Bess," Elara said. "Not tonight," Silas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've just become the most valuable piece on the chessboard. Blackwood wants your land, and now he knows I'm protecting it. He's going to get desperate." "My land?" Elara frowned. "It's just scrub and rocks. Why does everyone want it so badly?" The music swelled to a crescendo. Silas stopped, holding her for a beat longer than necessary. "Because," he whispered, "Copper Creek isn't just a name, Elara. It's a map. And your father knew it." The song ended. Silas released her, but kept her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. He led her toward the door, the crowd parting once again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't mocking. It was fearful. As they reached the double doors, Julian Blackwood shouted out, unable to help himself, "Thorne, you can't just walk in here and take over. There are laws in this town." Silas paused. He didn't turn around. He just spoke over his shoulder. "Laws written by thieves aren't laws, Blackwood. They're just threats with a wax seal. I suggest you have your books in order by Monday. I'll be auditing the bank's land seizures for the last 5 years." He pushed the doors open, leading Elara out into the cool night air. The ride back to the Vance homestead was a journey through a world that had suddenly shifted its axis. The moon hung heavy and full over the jagged silhouette of the Sawtooth Ridge, painting the sagebrush in silver and shadow. Silas's black stallion, a beast he called Cole, moved with a steady, ground-eating gait that made the miles disappear. Yet to Elara, time seemed to stretch. She sat in front of Silas, his arms caging her, protecting as he held the reins. The warmth of his chest against her back was a stark contrast to the biting wind that whipped down from the peaks. She was still wearing his heavy duster coat over her ruined dress, the leather smelling of pine smoke and gunpowder. "You're shivering," Silas noted, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He shifted the reins to one hand and pulled the coat tighter around her with the other. "I'm not cold," Elara lied, though her teeth were near chattering. I'm terrified. You just humiliated the two most powerful people in the territory. Julian Blackwood doesn't forgive, and he certainly doesn't forget. Blackwood is a coyote, Silas said dismissively. He yaps and he snaps, but he runs when he sees a wolf. You need to stop thinking like prey, Elara. It's hard not to think like prey when you've been hunted for 2 years, she whispered, looking out at the dark expanse of her family's land. Ever since Papa died, the bank, the mayor, the ranchers, they've all been circling, picking off the cattle, poisoning the water trough, scaring off the hands. I thought they just wanted the grazing land. Silas slowed the horse as they approached the narrow canyon pass that led to her cabin. Grazing land is a dime a dozen. Copper is worth money. But what your father found, that's worth an empire. Elara twisted in the saddle to look at him, her eyes wide in the moonlight. What are you talking about? Papa was a cattleman. He didn't know anything about mining. Thomas Vance was a lot of things, Silas said, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above them, his instincts on high alert. Before he settled down, he was a surveyor for the army. We rode together back in '78, down in the Arizona Territory. Elara gasped. You knew him? He never mentioned a Silas. I went by a different name back then, Silas said, his jaw tightening. And he wouldn't have mentioned me. I was the man who got into trouble, and he was the man who got me out. That's why I'm here. He sent me a letter 3 weeks before he died. He knew something was wrong. He knew someone was tampering with the brakes on his wagon the day he went off the cliff. Elara's heart stopped. The blizzard. Everyone said he lost his way in the blizzard. A man who could navigate the stars blindfolded doesn't get lost in his own backyard, Silas said grimly. He was murdered, Elara, and they did it because of what he found in the creek bed behind your cabin. Before Elara could process the horror of this revelation, a sharp crack echoed through the canyon walls. Silas reacted before the sound even registered fully. He jerked the reins hard to the right, spurring the stallion. Hang on! A bullet whizzed past Elara's ear, sounding like an angry hornet. It struck the rock face beside them, sending stone shards flying. Ambush! Silas shouted. He didn't panic. He moved with the lethal precision of a soldier. He guided the horse behind a large boulder, shielding them from the shooter on the ridge. Stay down, Silas commanded, swinging off the horse in one fluid motion. He reached for the Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard. They knew we were coming. Who? Elara cried, sliding off the horse and crouching in the dirt, the oversized coat bunching around her knees. Blackwood's hired guns. He didn't wait for Monday. Silas jacked around into the chamber. Stay behind the horse. Don't move until I tell you. Silas moved away from her, blending into the shadows of the canyon. Elara pressed her back against the warm flank of the stallion, her hands trembling. The silence that followed the gunshot was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, waiting silence. Another shot rang out, this time from the left. Silas returned fire instantly, the muzzle flash of his rifle illuminating the darkness for a split second. A cry of pain echoed from the rocks above. That's one, Silas's voice floated back to her. There's 3 of them, a rough voice shouted from the ridge. Get the girl! The boss said he wants the girl alive. Elara's blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to scare her off the land. They were going to take her. Silas moved again, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He was drawing their fire away from her. Bullets kicked up dust around his position, but he kept moving, firing with calm, rhythmic precision. Bang! Rack! Bang! Flank him! The voice screamed. Elara saw a shadow detach itself from the canyon wall and creep toward the boulder where she was hiding. It was a man with a bandana over his face, a knife glinting in his hand. He hadn't seen Silas. He was coming for her. Panic surged through her, but beneath it, a spark of anger ignited. This was her land. These were the men who killed her father. She looked around for a weapon. Her hand closed around a fist-sized rock. The man crept closer. He reached for the reins of the stallion. "Easy, boy," the man whispered to the horse. Ilara lunged. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She brought the rock down on the man's hand as it rested on the saddle. Bones crunched. The man howled, dropping the knife. He spun around, grabbing Ilara by the collar of the duster coat. "You little witch!" He raised his other hand to strike her, but the blow never landed. A shot rang out from 20 yards away. The man stiffened, his eyes going wide, and he crumpled to the ground, a dark hole in the center of his chest. Silas stood there, his rifle smoking. He didn't look at the body. He looked at Ilara. "I told you to stay down." "He was coming for the horse," Ilara said, her voice shaking but her chin high. "And I'm not good at following orders." Silas walked over, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The other two ran. Cowards. They expected a helpless girl, not a fight. He looked at the dead man, then nudged the body over with his boot. He pulled the bandana down. "I know him. One of the railway Pinkertons. Blackwood hired private security to do his dirty work." Silas looked at Ilara, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His hand was warm, grounding. "You did good," he said softly. "But we can't go to the cabin. They'll have men waiting there too." "Where do we go?" Ilara asked. "If they control the town and the road?" "We go to the one place they won't follow," Silas said, holstering his rifle. He mounted the horse and pulled her up behind him this time, wanting her close to his back, protected. "We're going up to the Devil's Pulpit." "The pulpit?" Ilara exclaimed. "That's a sheer drop. The trails are treacherous even in daylight." "Your father showed me a way up," Silas said, turning the horse toward the steep, winding path that led into the high mountains. "A hidden trail. It leads to the source." "The source of the creek?" "The source of the gold," Silas corrected. "It's not copper, Ilara. It never was. Thomas Vance was sitting on the largest vein of gold in the Wyoming Territory. And tonight, you're going to claim it." The ascent to the Devil's Pulpit was a nightmare of vertical drops and shifting shale. The wind up here was ferocious, tearing at their clothes and stinging their eyes. Below them, the valley of Copper Creek was a sea of black ink, with only the distant, flickering lights of Silver Springs acting as a reminder of civilization. They reached a small plateau just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. The air was thin and frigid. Silas helped Ilara down from the horse. Her legs were numb, her body exhausted, but her mind was racing. Gold. The word echoed in her head. Her father had struggled for years, wearing patched clothes, eating meager meals, all while guarding a secret that could have bought the entire state. "Why didn't he mine it?" Ilara asked, her voice raspy. She watched Silas tether the horse to a scrub pine. "We were starving, Silas. Why did he let us suffer if he had this?" Silas turned, his expression somber. "Because gold brings blood, Ilara. Look at what's happening now. The moment the rumor got out, Blackwood sent killers. Your father wanted to secure the land rights fully. Mineral rights, water rights, everything. Before he filed the claim. He was trying to protect you from the vultures. He was 1 week away from finalizing the patent when he died." Silas walked toward a cluster of boulders that formed a natural cave entrance, hidden by overgrown brush. "He brought me here once. He told me if anything ever happened to him, the proof was inside." Ilara followed him into the cave. It was shallow, but dry. In the back, tucked into a crevice in the rock, was a metal strongbox. It was rusted and covered in dust. Silas pulled it out and set it on the ground. "Do you have the key?" Ilara shook her head. "I didn't even know this existed." "Your necklace." Silas pointed to the silver locket she always wore, a cheap piece of jewelry her father had given her for her 16th birthday. "Let me see it." Ilara unclasped the locket and handed it to him. Silas didn't open it. Instead, he used his knife to pry open the back casing of the locket itself. A tiny flat key fell out into his palm. "He was a clever man," Silas murmured. He inserted the key into the strongbox. The lock clicked, the sound loud in the quiet cave. Inside were papers, stacks of geological surveys, assay reports, and a pristine, government-stamped deed. "This is it," Silas said, scanning the documents. "The survey confirms the vein. And this deed, it predates the bank's lien. It proves the land was paid for in full by military land grants your father earned. The bank has no claim. Blackwood's mortgage is fraudulent." Ilara took the paper, her fingers brushing the signature at the bottom. "Thomas Vance." Tears welled in her eyes. "He saved us." "He did," Silas said. "But a piece of paper is only as good as the man enforcing it. We need to get this to the circuit judge in Laramie. The local law is bought and paid for." "Laramie is a 3-day ride," Ilara said, panic rising again. "Blackwood will hunt us down before we get 10 miles. "We're not going to Laramie," Silas said, a hard glint in his eyes. "We're going back to Silver Springs." "Are you insane? That's suicide." "No," Silas said, standing up and checking his revolver. "It's politics. The governor is arriving in Silver Springs today for the railroad inauguration. Blackwood planned the jubilee to impress him. If we hand this proof to the governor in front of the entire town, Blackwood can't touch us. He can't bury the truth when the whole world is watching." "We have to walk right back into the lion's den," Ilara realized, the weight of the task settling on her. "Yes," Silas said. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "But this time, you're not walking in as a victim. You're walking in as the owner of the richest mine in the West. You need to look the part." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a clean white shirt and a black silk vest. "Put these on. Ditch the dress. It's time you rode like a Vance." By the time they reached the outskirts of Silver Springs, the sun was high. The town was buzzing with even more activity than the night before. Bunting in red, white, and blue draped the buildings. A brass band was playing near the train depot, where a gleaming locomotive, the first to test the new tracks, sat hissing steam. Silas and Ilara rode in, not through the back alleys, but right down Main Street. Ilara wore Silas's shirt, cinched at the waist with a belt, and her riding trousers. She looked wild, fierce, and undeniable. People stopped and stared. The whispers started immediately. "Is that the Vance girl?" "She's alive. I heard she ran off." "Who is that with her? Is that the gunman?" They rode straight up to the platform where a podium had been set up. Julian Blackwood was there, looking tired and anxious, standing next to a distinguished man with grey mutton chops, Governor Campbell. Sheriff Bull Cotter, a massive man with a star pinned to his greasy vest, stood guard at the stairs. When Julian saw them, his face went white. He grabbed the sheriff's arm. "Arrest them! Now! They're wanted for disturbing the peace." Sheriff Cotter stepped forward, hand on his gun. "Hold it right there, Thorne. Get down off that horse. You're under arrest." Silas didn't flinch. He kept his hands visible near the reins. "On what charge, Sheriff?" "Trespassing, assault," Cotter spat. "Mr. Blackwood says you threatened him." "I'm about to do more than threaten," Silas said, his voice booming over the crowd. He looked past the sheriff, locking eyes with the governor. "Governor Campbell, I have evidence of massive land fraud and attempted murder committed by Julian Blackwood." The crowd gasped. The music stopped. "Don't listen to him, Governor," Julian shrieked, his composure shattering. "He's a bandit, a liar." "Let him speak," Governor Campbell said, his voice authoritative. He stepped forward, intrigued. "Who are you, sir?" "I am Silas Thorne, and this," he gestured to Ilara, "is Ilara Vance, the rightful owner of the land this railroad is trying to cross." "Shoot him!" Julian screamed at the sheriff. "He's reaching for a gun." Sheriff Cotter drew his weapon. Ilara screamed, "No!" But Silas was faster. He didn't shoot the sheriff. He shot the hat off the sheriff's head. The bang caused chaos. The crowd screamed and ducked. Cotter stumbled back, dropping his gun in shock. "Next one goes between your eyes, Bull," Silas warned, his voice like cold steel. "Governor, I hold in my hand a federal land patent and a geological survey proving that Julian Blackwood forged mortgage documents to steal the Vance claim. He killed Thomas Vance to hide a gold vein." "Lies!" Julian yelled, looking around for an escape route. He saw Lydia Sterling in the crowd, but she was backing away, distancing herself from the sinking ship. Governor Campbell looked from the shaking banker to the steady, rugged man on the horse. "Bring the documents here, son." Silas dismounted, helping Ilara down. They walked up the steps of the platform, past the cowering sheriff. Ilara held the strong box. She placed it on the podium in front of the governor. "My father died for this," Ilara said, her voice ringing clear and strong. She looked Julian dead in the eye. "And you tried to destroy me for a dress. You thought I was weak because I was poor. But you forgot one thing, Mr. Blackwood." "What's that?" Julian hissed, sweat pouring down his face. "I'm a Vance," she said, "and we don't break." The governor examined the papers, his brow furrowed, then cleared. He looked up, his face stern. "Sheriff Cotter?" Yes, Governor," the sheriff stammered. "Arrest Mr. Blackwood," the governor commanded, "for fraud, embezzlement, and suspicion of murder." The crowd erupted. Cheers went up. The townspeople, tired of Blackwood's tyranny, roared their approval. Julian lunged. He didn't run. He pulled a derringer from his sleeve and aimed it point blank at Ilara. "If I go down, you're coming with me." Bang! The shot deafened Ilara. She flinched, waiting for the pain. But it was Julian who fell. Silas stood there, his revolver smoking in his hand. He had fired from the hip, a shot so fast no one had seen him draw. Julian Blackwood lay on the platform, clutching his shoulder, the derringer skittering away. "I told you," Silas said calmly, holstering his gun. "I'm a patient creditor. But your time is up." Ilara looked at Silas. In the chaos of the cheering crowd and the arresting deputies, the world seemed to narrow down to just him. He had saved her life, her land, and her dignity. But as the adrenaline faded, a new fear took root. The battle was won, but Silas was a wandering soul, a man who fixed things and moved on. Would he stay? Or was this just another job for the man who owed a debt to a ghost? The weeks following the arrest of Julian Blackwood transformed Silver Springs from a dusty outpost into the epicenter of a frantic gold rush. Word of the Vance vein had spread as far as St. Louis, bringing a deluge of prospectors, investors, and journalists. The quiet solitude of the canyon was replaced by the distant ring of pickaxes and the rumble of heavy machinery. Ilara Vance sat on the porch of her cabin, which was no longer a drafty shack, but the centerpiece of a bustling operation. She wore a dress of crisp navy calico, new and well-fitted, though she felt strange in it. The townspeople who had once stepped over her in the street now tipped their hats with exaggerated respect. The butcher saved her the best cuts. The dressmaker offered her services for free. It made Ilara's stomach turn. Their kindness was purchased, not earned. The only person who treated her the same was Silas, but Silas was pulling away. He spent his days down at the mine entrance, overseeing the security and ensuring the new crew, honest men he had wired for from Cheyenne, were treating the land right. At night, he slept in the bunkhouse with the hands, not in the guest room Ilara had prepared. He was like a ghost, haunting the very life he had saved. One afternoon, a carriage rattled up the newly graded road to the homestead. It was an opulent thing, black lacquer with gold trim. To Ilara's surprise, Lydia Sterling stepped out. The mayor's daughter looked diminished. Her emerald silk was wrinkled, her face pale and drawn. The arrest of Julian Blackwood had implicated her father in several zoning scandals. The Sterlings were social pariahs, their influence evaporating like rain in the desert. Ilara stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Lydia, to what do I owe the pleasure? I assume you're not here to trip me again." Lydia flinched, clutching her reticule tightly. She looked around at the bustling mine, the healthy cattle grazing in the lower pasture, and finally at Ilara. The envy in her eyes was dull now, replaced by a desperate, clawing need. "I came to apologize," Lydia said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "For the Jubilee. It was a misunderstanding. Julian, he manipulated us all." "Julian is a snake," Ilara said evenly, leaning against the porch railing. "But he didn't make you cruel, Lydia. You did that all on your own." Lydia swallowed hard. "My father. The town council is voting to remove him next week. If that happens, we lose the house. We have nowhere to go." She stepped closer, forcing a trembling smile. "I was hoping, for the sake of our old friendship, before everything happened, you might speak to the governor. He listens to you. If you vouched for my father." Ilara looked at the woman who had laughed while she knelt in spilled wine. She remembered the shame, the heat of the tears, the feeling of being less than human. "I don't have old friendships with you, Lydia," Ilara said softly. "I was your target. And as for your house, perhaps you can learn to sew. I hear the potato sacks at the general store are quite durable." Lydia's face crumbled. She turned to leave, humiliated, but stopped when a shadow fell over her. Silas stood there. He had come up from the creek, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing scars on his forearms. He held a Winchester in the crook of his arm. He didn't look at Lydia with anger, but with total indifference. "You heard the lady," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Ride on." Lydia scrambled back into her carriage, shouting at the driver to go. As the dust settled, Ilara felt a heavy weight lift from her chest. She had found her voice. She turned to Silas, a smile forming. "Thank you." Again. Silas didn't smile back. He leaned the rifle against the rail and took a step back, maintaining that maddening distance. "I came to tell you I'm heading out, Ilara." The world seemed to stop spinning. "Heading out? To town?" "To Montana," Silas said, avoiding her eyes. He looked toward the mountains. "The mine is secure. The governor has the legalities locked down. You're rich, Ilara. You're safe. You don't need a gunman shadowing you anymore." "I never needed a gunman," Ilara said, her voice rising. She stepped off the porch, closing the gap between them. "I needed you." "You don't know who I am," Silas said sharply. "You know the man who saved the day. You don't know the man who spent 10 years hunting outlaws in the mud. I'm not a rancher. I'm not a gentleman. I don't fit in this world you're building." "You fit because I say you fit," Ilara cried, grabbing his arm. His muscles were tense, rigid as iron. "You think I care about the gold, the governor? I care that you were the only one who saw me when I was invisible. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Silas looked down at her, and for a second, the mask slipped. Ilara saw a depth of longing that took her breath away. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a touch so tender it made her tremble. "It means everything," he whispered. "That's why I have to go. A woman like you're the sun, Ilara, and I'm just the shadow that gets in the way of the light. You have a future now. Find a man who can give you peace, not a man who sleeps with one eye open." He pulled away before she could stop him. "I'll be gone by first light. Don't come to the station." Ilara watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, her heart breaking in her chest. She had faced down bankers and bandits, but she didn't know how to fight a man's own stubborn self-loathing. The dawn broke with a sullen grey light mirroring the storm inside Ilara. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night pacing the floorboards, the silence of the empty cabin deafening. "He's wrong," she thought furiously. "He thinks he's protecting me. He's just running away." She looked at the clock. The morning train to Cheyenne, the express that connected to the northern lines toward Montana, left at 8 a.m. It was 7:15. Ilara didn't hesitate. She didn't dress in the fine calico or the silks she could now afford. She went to the back of the wardrobe and pulled out the old blue dress, the one her mother had worn, the one stained with wine. She had washed it, but the faint purple stains remained, a map of her history. She threw on her riding coat, grabbed her father's hat, and ran for the stable. "Bess!" she called, saddling the old mare. "One last run, girl." She rode like a demon. She cut across the open range, jumping fences she usually opened, ignoring the road. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes, but she kept her gaze fixed on the plume of smoke rising from the Silver Springs depot. She could hear the whistle blowing. "Hoo-hoo!" the conductor's signal. "No, no, no!" Ilara gasped, kicking the mare into a gallop. She skidded into the town square, scattering chickens and startling pedestrians. She didn't tie the horse. She jumped off while Bess was still moving and sprinted onto the platform. The train was already hissing, the massive iron wheels beginning their slow, grinding turn. The conductor was pulling up the stairs. "Wait!" Ilara screamed, pushing through a crowd of well-wishers. "Stop the train!" She ran alongside the moving cars, scanning the windows. She saw businessmen, families, soldiers, and then, on the rear platform of the last car, she saw him. Silas was leaning against the railing, watching the town recede. He looked miserable. "Silas!" she shouted, waving her hat. He straightened, his eyes widening. He saw her running, stumbling in the dust, wearing that damned blue dress. "Ilara, go back!" he shouted over the noise of the engine. "You coward!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You facing down 3 gunmen in a canyon, but you're scared of one woman?" The train was picking up speed. She was losing ground. She couldn't catch it. "I love you," she yelled, the words ripping from her throat. "And if you leave, you're taking the only real thing in this town with you." Silas stared at her. The train was moving away, putting distance between them. 10 yards, 20 yards. He looked at the horizon, then at the woman who was shrinking in the distance. Suddenly, Silas vaulted over the railing. He didn't use the stairs. He jumped, hitting the gravel embankment with a roll. He tumbled, dust flying, and came up onto his feet in one fluid motion. The train whistled again and chugged away, disappearing around the bend. Ilara stopped running, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her dusty face. Silas stood up, brushing the dirt from his black duster. He adjusted his hat and began to walk back toward her. He didn't hurry. He walked with the steady, inevitable purpose of a man coming home. He stopped 2 feet from her. "You jumped," Ilara breathed, laughing through her tears. "I missed my stop," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You said you didn't fit," she challenged him, crossing her arms. "I was wrong," Silas admitted. He stepped closer, taking her face in his rough hands. "I thought I had to be a gentleman to deserve you. I thought I had to be clean." He looked down at her wine-stained dress. "But you wore the dress." "It's my best dress," she whispered. "It's the one I wore when I met the love of my life." Silas kissed her then. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a claiming. It happened right there on the platform, in front of the station master and the town gossip. A kiss that scorched the earth and promised forever. "Ahem." A polite cough interrupted them. They broke apart, breathless. Governor Campbell was standing nearby, holding a briefcase, looking amused. "Mr. Thorne," the governor said, tipping his hat. "I assume since you jumped off the train, you won't be needing to wire your resignation to the board of directors?" Ilara frowned, looking between the two men. "Resignation? Board of directors?" Silas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked sheepishly at Ilara. "There's one thing I didn't tell you." "What?" Ilara asked, narrowing her eyes. "I didn't just buy the debt on your ranch because I had some savings," Silas said. "And I wasn't just a surveyor or a gunman." "He," Governor Campbell interjected with a grin, "is Silas Thorne Vanderbilt. He owns the Union Pacific West expansion. He owns the train you just chased, the tracks it runs on, and frankly, half the steel in Pennsylvania." Ilara's jaw dropped. She stepped back, looking at his worn boots, his dusty coat, the gun belt. "You're a tycoon. You're one of the richest men in America." "I hate the boardrooms," Silas shrugged, looking like a boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "I prefer the field. I like to see the land before I build on it. That's why I was undercover. I wanted to see if Silver Springs was worth a station." "And is it?" Ilara asked, still in shock. Silas looked around the dusty town, then back at Ilara, his eyes shining with gold that had nothing to do with the mine. "It wasn't," Silas said, taking her hand and placing it over his heart. "But it is now. I'm building the headquarters here. I'm not going anywhere, Ilara Vance. I'm done running." Ilara looked at the man who could buy the world, but who had chosen to jump off a moving train into the dirt just to be with her. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "Well then, Mr. Vanderbilt," she said, pulling him toward her horse. "You'd better come home. We have a lot of work to do. And I expect you to fix the fence you broke last night." Silas laughed, a sound that rang out like a bell, pure and free. "Yes, ma'am." They rode back toward the canyon together, not as a poor rancher and a drifter, but as the king and queen of Copper Creek. The town watched them go, and for the first time in history, no one mocked the girl in the old blue dress. They just wished they were her. And that is the story of how Ilara Vance turned a moment of public humiliation into a lifetime of triumph. It reminds us that your worth is never defined by the clothes on your back or the opinions of small-minded people. True value comes from the courage to stand your ground, the loyalty to protect what is yours, and the wisdom to recognize a diamond in the rough, even if he's wearing a dusty coat. Ilara didn't just win the gold, she won the heart of the only man who saw her true spirit. If you enjoyed this dramatic Wild West romance and want more stories where the underdog takes it all, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who needs a little inspiration, and subscribe so you never miss a new story. What would you have done if you were Ilara? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.